Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 9th seminar in the Deakin Science and Society Network Healthy Futures seminar series. My name is Professor Jeff Craig, and I lead the Early Life Epigenetics group within the Impact Institute at the School of Medicine at Deakin University. I also lead the Gene Equality Deakin University Research Network. My colleague Alfred Deakin, Professor Emma Koval, and I are organizers of this Healthy Future seminar series. The Science and Society Network was formed in 2018 in recognition that scientists and humanities and social science researchers need to work together to meet the great challenges of this century. No single academic field can bring about the changes that we need to see in the world. Bridging disciplinary divides is the key to finding new solutions to the problems we all face. The Science and Society Network early and mid-career researchers across the university are embarking on groundbreaking interdisciplinary projects. I would now like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the unceded lands, skies, and waterways to which our students and staff come together. We pay our deep respect to the elders and ancestors who have cared for this country, an ancient place where education, innovation, and knowledge transfer have taken place for many thousands of years. In particular, we give gratitude for the elders of ancestors of Wadawurrung country, Wurundjeri country, and Eastern Maar country, much of which had its land rights formally recognized last week, where our physical campuses are located. Next, for a quick rundown of the structure for today's event. It'll be similar to our usual format. I will introduce our speaker, Professor Nancy Segal. Nancy will present for 35 minutes, and then we'll be joined by Dr. Evie Kendal and Associate Professor Neera Bhatia for a 20-minute discussion with Nancy before we throw to the general discussion and the question and answers from the audience. That will last around 30 minutes and will end about 11:30 AEST. I'll be co-chairing the discussion here on Zoom with my colleague, Professor Emma Koval, and my colleague, Karina Traits, will be moderating the YouTube live chat. We're very keen to hear and answer your questions, so you can either post questions into YouTube chat or send on Twitter at SSN Deakin, and make sure you use hashtags, hashtag SSN Seminar and hashtag Healthy Futures. So now to begin, I'm delighted to introduce my good friend and collaborator, Professor Nancy Segal. Dr. Segal works in the Department of Psychology at California State University, Fullerton. She received a BA degree in psychology and English literature from Boston University in 1973, an MA in 1974, and a PhD in 1982 in the social sciences and behavioral sciences from the University of Chicago. From 82 to 91, she was the postdoctoral fellow and research associate at the University of Minnesota, affiliated with the well-known Minnesota study of twins reared apart. She is currently professor of psychology at California State University, Fullerton, and director of the Twin Studies Center, which she founded in 1991. Dr. Segal is regarded as a world-class expert on twins and twin research, as evidenced by her prolific scientific writing and numerous invitations to address national and international audiences, both professional and public. Her 8th book on twins, Twin Children of the Holocaust, Stolen Children and the Will to Survive, an annotated collection of photographs she took at the 40th anniversary reunion of twin survivors of the brutal medical experimentation of Dr. Joseph Mengele, was released in March 2023. And her 9th book, Twin Fathers, Gay Sons, The Citizenship Case That Captured the World, will be published in August this year. So over to you, Nancy.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much, Jeff. It's really an honor to address this group. I've always been so in favor of interdisciplinary societies that bring together disciplines that really need to be in touch with one another. And so this has really been a great honor. I just wish that I could have flown to Melbourne to be there personally, but given our technology, we're able to at least have it on Zoom. So I'm going to share my screen now, and I think this should work. We tried it before and should be absolutely perfect. And I think it is. So today I'm going to discuss the book Deliberately Divided, the controversial study of twins and triplets adopted apart. And I want to tell you a little bit about how I got involved in this, because, I've done twin research for many years, and I had at the time that I first learned about the study in the fall of 1982. But this study was different. It was disturbing, it was unsettling, but it was also intriguing, and I wanted to know why. So I had arrived at the University of Minnesota as a brand new postdoc in the fall of 1982. And at the time, CBS's news magazine, 60 Minutes, was planning an expose of this particular project, and everybody was talking about it. In my lab, it was exciting, it was disturbing. We all waited to see what was going to happen, but eventually, somehow the program never came up. It was squashed, and I will say a little bit more about why that happened momentarily. But at any rate, it involved Dr. Viola Bernard, who was a Columbia University psychiatrist, who was also a psychiatric consultant to Louise Wise Services. Now, understand that Louise Wise Services was the premier adoption agency in New York City, mainly serviced, at least in the beginning, Jewish families in search of Jewish babies. And she worked with her collaborator, Dr. Peter Neubauer, who had escaped Nazi persecution in Vienna, came to New York City, and he was the head of the Child Development Center. So I knew about this study since the fall of 82, and I followed it from time to time. It would come, it would go. And I stayed in touch. At one point, my advisor or my mentor at postdoc, Professor Bouchard, met Larry Perlman, who was one of the assistants. And so Larry and I got involved with each other and did some research on our own. But it was actually the films in 2017 and 2018 that really forced my hand and really convinced me that it was time for a book. The 2017 film is one you've probably not seen. It's called The Twinning Reaction, and it presents a lot of the scientific side of this particular project. And then the 2018 film, Three Identical Strangers, which I think more people have seen because it's streamed on Netflix, presented the case of the identical triplets who were separated and reunited at the age of 19. I think both films were excellent. They took different parts of the project. But one thing I will say about the 2018 film is that it left out a very important player, and that was Dr. Viola Bernard. And we'll talk more about what exactly her role was in a moment. In 2017, when I was involved with that first film, Lori Shinseki, the director, said to me, look, I have mountains of material I'll just give to you. And when I heard that, of course, I knew I was going to do this book, but I was a little uncertain. I knew it would be controversial. At any rate, so I consulted the Columbia University archives, where Viola Bernard had deposited a great deal of her material. I did interviews with the investigators' colleagues and assistants, and some people were willing to talk to me on the record, some people not at all, and some people anonymously. And at first, because I was so used to twin studies and people wanting to talk to me, I was really miffed by this, that people didn't want to talk. But then I began to see that people were uncomfortable. The study got a lot of bad controversy through the 2017 and 2018 films, and they didn't want to be involved. So I took that as information. I have tape recordings from somebody who interviewed the original investigators, and I actually was able to interview Peter Neubauer some years back. I also interviewed the twins' family members, bioethicists, and attorneys, and the finished product was the book Deliberately Divided, which was released in November of 2021. So the principal colleagues, Dr. Viola Bernard, as I said, Columbia University and Louise Wise Services, and she had done a lot of good work. She had helped a lot of Jews being persecuted in Germany and throughout Eastern Europe. She brought them to the United States. She let them stay in her house in Nyack. And Peter Neubauer, Child Development Center head at the Jewish Board of Guardians, he had to flee Vienna. He had to get his medical degree in Bern, Switzerland. And so, you would think that these two people, especially Neubauer, would be sympathetic to keeping families together. But it's amazing what blind scientific ambition can do. And this is Dr. Larry Perlman, one of several assistants. Now, he was a graduate student at the time he got involved, thinking that he could use some of the data for his PhD dissertation. He left after 10 months because he was so disgusted with how the data were collected and how they were stored and processed that he just left and knew that it was not something that he was going to be successful with. But he kept a lot of his original notes, which were very valuable to me and to the film directors. And these are the two triplets, Robert and David. I took a picture of them in June of 2018 when they attended my book party. And you know, if you've seen the film, that these are the two surviving triplets. I think they're now in their 50s. When they were in their 30s, their third brother, Eddie, committed suicide. And if you want more details on that, I can share that later. But I want to get on with the story. So I want to set the scene with this quote from Melanie, who was one of the separated identical twins who was unknowingly part of the twin study. Melanie wrote, "I wish someone would start a support group. This is all so crazy. No one, not even us twins, understand the complexity." So Viola Bernard had this idea of separating twins. Now, before we go through the list, let me just point out that people at the time were aware that twins have some unique issues growing up. Sometimes there's competition, identity issues, but nobody would ever suggest that they separate them and raise them in different homes. So Bernard's justification was, she claims, was supported by the professional literature of the time. I can tell you honestly, I have combed the child development literature at the time. I've spoken to researchers and clinicians who were there at the time. There is no such literature. Bernard argued that it was advantageous for twins' identity development. She said it would avoid parental overburdening. She argued that when and if twins should meet as adults, they would be better prepared to manage their relationship. That was actually the opposite, and there were some very difficult outcomes as a result of that. Interestingly, all identical twins were placed with a sibling older by 3 years, the male twins with the female twins with the male. And ironically, this was done to avoid being an only child. Fraternal twins were separated, but they were not studied, another indication of what bad science was done. Even families requesting twins were given one newborn. There were twins available, as you know, but they were told that there were not. Let me point out that this study was done without the knowledge of the parents, without the knowledge that they were raising a singleton twin. Now, the researchers were exciting. Why was this exciting? Because it was the first prospective assessment of infant twins reared apart from birth. And what the researchers hoped to do was to link parenting practices to child outcomes. But as we know, let me just digress for a moment. The significance of twin research goes far beyond what Louise Wise Services and the Child Development Center had in mind. Twin research is a simple and elegant approach to disentangling genetic and environmental influences on behavioral, physical, and medical traits. There are many variants of the classic MZ-DZ twin comparison, such as the twin family design and twins raised apart. Twin data can be used to understand and assist individuals in the non-twin population when it comes to behavioral difficulties or disease. And twin research is not just for twins, it's for everyone. Although some studies are targeted to twins and their families, such as dressing alike, school separation, issues such as those. Now, here, this is I love. Was there justification for separation? As I said, Bernard never studied specific studies. It was always the professional or the child development literature at the time. That's it. In 1986, after the study had basically been over for about 5 years, Dr. Samuel Abrams, who was a collaborator, referenced 5 studies that he said supported her separation of twins. So I went and I looked at all 5 of those studies. They were all case studies or reviews. Some were on fraternal pairs, and there was no mention of zygosity diagnosis. That is how they knew the twins were identical or fraternal. Also, because they were case studies, they tended to be outliers in the scheme of things. They were twins with unusual issues or behavioral problems, hardly representative of twins in general. And in fact, one of the studies that was cited in support by Dr. Abrams was by a Dr. Dorothy Burlingham that, in a book she published in 1952, but she did not endorse separate rearing. If you look at the last section of her book, she talks about some of the issues twins have and says that these are best handled by sensitive parents who will, pay attention to their twins. And, every family has issues. Siblings have issues. Parents and children have issues. You don't tear a family apart. You solve them. Here is the twin study protocol. And it's very difficult to get a sense of this because the data have been deposited at Yale University with the stipulation that they not be released until 2065. I believe that Bernard and Neubauer did this to protect themselves. They said they did it to protect the twins. I hardly think that's the case, because if they were out to protect the twins, they wouldn't have done this study to begin with. Why they chose Yale as opposed to New York City, Yale's a little bit out of the way. That's one issue. Neubauer had contacts at Yale. So there's a whole debate raging within library science. Do you accept an archive that you can't open for years to come? And who really owns the data? I should point out that the twins do have access to the data upon consent, but they have to go through a very rigorous process to get it. So, twin study protocol, birth to age 12. And by the way that I know this is that there was some information in the Viola Bernard archive, and some of the twins who did get their material at Yale did share it with me. So the twins are immediately put into foster care after birth. And they were put into joint foster care for the most part. And newborn assessments were made of them periodically until the time of their adoption. Once they were adopted, there were periodic home visits that were fairly frequent during the first couple of years of life and then tapered off to maybe 1 or 2 times a year until they turned 12. There was repeated IQ testing. There was projective testing, such as with the Rorschach, and countless interviews and observations. There is actually a chapter from a book that was intended to be published and never was. And the interviews and observations are absolutely so detailed, but I don't know that there's anything in them that we could use today that we can't get through better means. So many people want to know how many twins were studied. Actually, fewer than I think people realize. There were 11 twins in total who were studied. They were the members of 4 MZ twin pairs, 3 female and 1 male, and the 1 male triplet set. In the beginning, there was actually a 5th MZ female twin pair that was omitted. Another example of bad science. Why were they omitted? They were omitted because the girls had very different birth weights, and one was adopted months earlier than the other. So their situations weren't really balanced or comparable. But that's okay, because you can see if those kinds of factors affect development. But they didn't see it that way. There were also dizygotic twin pairs who were separated but not studied. And this is a puzzle. Why they were separated and not studied is just not something I can comprehend. The only reason I can think is that it took time to do the zygosity diagnosis. They did it through blood typing and placental examination, which we know can be misleading. But at any rate, perhaps they separated them so that in case they were monozygotic, they'd already be separated. But I don't know for sure. There were 3 twin pairs like this, 2 female and 1 opposite sex. And then there was another female twin pair with zygosity uncertain. So everybody says that there were 11 twins in total, the 4 MZ twin pairs plus the triplets. That's 8 plus 3 is 11. Now, one of the assistants who I spoke to, and in fact, she was the one that you might have seen if you've seen 3 Identical Strangers. I can't recall her name right now. She had a heavy European accent, but she was not an assistant on the study, but she was an assistant at the Child Development Center. She says there were 21 multiple birth children. So I tried to figure out why 21, and I understand why now. Because if you consider the 13 MZ twins, if you count the omitted pair, that's 13, plus the 8, so the 3 dizygotic, so that would add, 8 plus 3, well, all right, that adds another 6 pairs. And then the 1 uncertain zygosity gives you a total of 21. So I think that's where they got the number of 21. All right. It's so important to consider the unethical and also the legal aspects of this case. In March of 2019, I was invited to a conference at the University of Virginia Law School called The Twinning Reaction, Science and Deception. And it brought together various lawyers, psychologists, ethicists. And I was particularly struck by a comment by one of the attorneys, Catherine Ross, who said law and ethics are not always running along the same course. The law said, okay. Ethics asked, are you out of your minds? What she's trying to get across here is that what Neubauer and colleagues did was not illegal. They were within their bounds. You know, informed consent was not something that was really done at the time, although informed consents were prepared, supposedly, but never really distributed or received from the parents. And they never went through any kind of IRBs. I mean, IRBs didn't exist in the early 60s. That was much later in the, say, early mid-70s. But nevertheless, we had various international bodies, the Nuremberg trials, they should have known about that, which really emphasized the well-being of human subjects. That was completely ignored. So legally, they were within their bounds. Ethically, I think they crossed a very, very dangerous line. Because you don't deny somebody a twinship, you don't deny somebody the knowledge of their birth, and you don't deny the adoptive parents everything you can tell them about your child. Now, the Louise Wise services had an odd policy where they said, we tell the adoptive parents just enough, but just enough is a very subjective kind of thing. It can change case to case. So I think that knowing that your child is a twin is a very important factor. Now, here's something else I want to mention, which also I think really crosses ethical lines. Among those 4 MZ twin pairs, there was a pair that could have met each other at the age of 6 or 7 because one was confused for the other and the parents were told. The parents were horrified that they were raising a singleton twin that they didn't know about. So they went to see Viola Bernard, and she said, you've got to keep this a secret from the children. Don't ever tell them they're a twin. So the parents did this. You know, Viola Bernard's a doctor, if she's the voice of authority. Well, these 2 girls were both dancers. And when they met at age 17 because of their dancing, they confronted their parents who knew all along. And in one family in particular, the family dynamics and trust were completely destroyed. I also interviewed Dr. Mark Mercurio, the director of biomedical ethics at Yale University, and he gave me this wonderful quote. Behaviors such as violating people's privacy are inappropriate on the part of researchers because they are wrong. Just because laws do not make them illegal does not justify carrying out such activities. I wouldn't say that because you were within the rules, it was okay to me. There's something deeper than just following the rules. So I think he's really putting some meat on the bones of what Catherine Ross said in the previous slide, that there are certain things that you just don't do because they are wrong. And, you know, some of the parents and some of the twins have referred to the investigators as Nazis. And that's something that I address in the book. These were not Nazi scientists. The children were loved, they were well cared for, they were not physically harmed in any way. But it was a manipulation of lives that was completely unacceptable and uncalled for. And I thought to myself, if I were one of those twins, how would I feel? And I would be horrified. I would be disgusted. I would be sad, which is the range of emotions these twins feel. You know, meeting at a later age, Bernard thought that would be helpful. It wasn't. Many of the twins don't get along because they didn't develop a shared social history. And I think that that was part of the issue involving the triplets, which we can talk about perhaps in the Q&A. Now, some of the investigators, or I should say some of the colleagues of Peter Neubauer's that I spoke with, and even some of the investigators, bring up what I call the culture of the times argument. I don't believe in it one bit. It really goes as follows, that past policies should be evaluated with reference to the social and cultural climate of the time. Well, I think we can understand them, but we cannot excuse them, and that is what I fear. I argue that if the above can be justified, how do we explain the Me Too movement and other current efforts, such as Nazi atrocities or the people who do blackface, to challenge past activities we consider to be unacceptable? If we let these things go unchallenged, we run the great risk that they will repeat themselves in the future. So here is the book that I came up with. It was published in November of 2021. And it's an overview of twin studies. I provide the researchers' backgrounds, the origins and methods of the study, the twins' life histories, and I had some new pairs that nobody has ever heard about. Melanie and Ellen being one of them, Susan and Anne being another. I talk about the concerns, the media exposure, and the publication. And as you know, the legalities and morality of the study, and some very big questions that, you know, we can debate forever and not answer. Now, I have some time left, and before I get to the acknowledgements, I want to talk about a couple of issues. One being the triplets. So Eddie, the triplet who took his life in his early 30s, the movie, I think, gives you the impression that he did so because he didn't really fit into his family background. He had a very strict father who'd been in the army, and he never felt a good fit in his family. I think that may have been a slight contributing factor because many adoptees don't feel they fit in their family's background. The other two triplets, Bob and David, had families that were much more loving and warm. But at any rate, the triplets put together a restaurant called the Triplets Romanian Steakhouse, and it was a great success. I've been there, and it was a wonderful establishment. They had the effusive personalities to keep that going. But they did not share a social history. And so at one point, Bobby walked away, left the restaurant with Eddie and David, and Bobby went and got a law degree. That was a big separation. And the triplet threesome was very important to Eddie. It was so important to him, more so than the others, perhaps because of his background. Before he committed suicide, David's father, who had taken in all the boys, and they called them bubula, the Yiddish word, he had passed away. So with him passing away and Bobby leaving the restaurant, I think that a lot of that just came together. Also, keep in mind that the triplets had a lot of psychopathology in their backgrounds. All three had been in psychiatric institutions I think on a partial outpatient basis by the time they were 16. And their mother was an alcoholic with pathology. I don't know the full scope of it. So there was a predisposed genotype in this sort of adverse environment. I also want to talk about publications. So there have been about 4, maybe 5 papers, mostly book chapters, that have come out in collected psychoanalytic studies. They did not publish in the mainstream. And why? Because they wanted to keep things kind of close. When they were doing their research, they got very, very upset when anybody from the outside would discover what they were doing. So I sensed that at some level, they understood that what they were doing was not quite right, but they kept it close. Now, nevertheless, they were excited, and they were actually surprised by the genetic influences, because these MZ twins were very similar, despite the different rearing practices to which they were subjected. So there was, and let me say a word about the papers. The papers are very repetitive, and you see the same pairs repeating it over and over again. So there's really not that much that's new in them. And they're very much written in the psychoanalytic vein. When it came time for a book, they got a contract with the Yale University Press. And the idea was a comprehensive book. Now, they didn't have the informed consents in place that they needed from the parents. So they had it from one pair that they decided to use. And for the other pair, which they really wanted to use, they decided we'll use a little bit from them, which, of course, is not ethical. And I was able to find one chapter, as I said, in Viola Bernard's archives. But I followed the whole history of the publication at Yale as much as I possibly could. They chose Yale University Press because of Peter Neubauer's affiliation. He was the editor of Psychoanalytic Study of the Child, which was published by Yale University Press. So the book went through various contracts, as books do, and then it stopped. And they had signed the contract, but the book was never published. I think it was because of the informed consent, but I can't say for sure, because they would not let me see the letter. So then what happened was Peter Neubauer and his son wrote a book called Nature's Thumbprint. And it's a very peculiar book because it was published by a mainstream publisher. And it talks about a lot of things on personality development, but has sections on twins. And the editor agreed to publish it, even though, there was no informed consent, but she agreed to publish it so that the researchers could use data from other pairs, there were 3 previous studies of reared apart twins at the time, and case history has been published. So they cited examples of other pairs, which, it was misleading because you got the impression that was the pairs that they studied. So unless you knew the literature very well, it was a very misleading kind of a book. And the editor told me that she feels the book did not do well because they did not have the original data, and that may well be the case. There are so many issues that we could talk about, so many things. I can just say that writing this book for me was a challenge because I never wrote a book that was so difficult in terms of getting people to speak to me, although many did, but many didn't. But I feel like I grew as a scholar and as an author because of it. And I've learned some tricks to getting people to talk. So let me just show you my acknowledgements. First and foremost, of course, the twins, their families, and the others who shared their thoughts. Roman and Littlefield Publishers, Carol Mann, my literary agent, and a special acknowledgement to Michelle Mordkoff. Michelle Mordkoff was one of the fraternal separated twins, born in 1964, who passed away suddenly at 2021 due to cancer. She and her twin sister Allison met about August of 2018, and they got along absolutely beautifully. Michelle was on the East Coast, Allison on the West Coast, but they made frequent trips back and forth. They just loved each other. And now Allison's had her twin taken from her a second time. And so I really want to give a special acknowledgement to Michelle Mordkoff. So I think I'm done with my 35 minutes. I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and I'm going to let Jeff and my other host take over.
Many thanks, Nancy. That was a great talk. And to me, if I hadn't read the book, I'd be dashing to the shops to buy it now, because you whetted people's appetites to find out more, to really dig deeper into all those issues you discussed. So I'd now like to invite discussant responses from Dr. Evie Kendal and Associate Professor Neera Bhatia to discuss and add perspectives. So short biogs. Dr. Evie Kendal is an emerging technology bioethicist whose work focuses on reproductive biotechnologies and space ethics. She's currently working as a senior lecturer of health promotion at Swinburne University of Technology in Victoria, Australia. Evie's research interests include artificial womb technology, ethical issues in aerospace medicine, and public health education. I see future SSN talks there, at least a couple there, Evie. Neera Bhatia is an associate professor at Deakin University School of Law, Melbourne. Her research interests are in the area of health law and bioethics, more specifically end-of-life decision-making for critically ill infants and children. She also researches in the area of organ donation, voluntary assisted dying, and emerging health and reproductive technologies. Neera actively engages with the wider community on issues that are topical in health law. She regularly appears in the media as an expert commentator in her areas of research. Now, who wants to go first?
I'm happy to. We're both happy to.
Very eager.
Evie, you go first.
Okay, fantastic. Well, first off, obviously, thank you so much, Nancy, for a fantastic talk. I know everyone will be really interested in the perspectives that you've shared today. So I just wanted to discuss just one thing that jumped out at me, which was a very convincing argument regarding the fact that we didn't have IRBs, so institutional review boards, or what we would call an HREC here, a Human Research Ethics Committee. Just because they didn't exist at the time does not mean the culture of the time defense will hold. And your whole talk illustrated that so well. So you have the blind scientific ambition from the doctor who already should know better, had the information to know that they shouldn't be separating families, had a personal sort of experience as well. And then you've got the RA who actually is disgusted by how the research is being done and does exercise their right to walk away. So even though it was legal, even though it was allowed, they can still choose to leave. So they didn't need an IRB to tell them that this is not the right thing to do. They could become aware of that themselves. You discuss the twins being unknowingly recruited into a study and how you don't deny someone twinship and you don't deny adoptive parents information about their child, because we know that that is wrong. Again, an ethics committee would talk about consent, informed consent, and avoiding coercion and all of these elements that we have in our sort of bioethics language now. But we didn't need that to know that that was not the right thing to do, that something was being cheated from these families. And of course, some of the tragic outcomes that you mentioned are evidence of that. And again, my students will often say, why do I need a full lit review before I can go to ethics? And you've mentioned Bernard's justification was supported by lies. The literature did not exist, that you've searched for this evidence of child development literature of the time, but that it wasn't there. So now we would request that literature review in the ethics committee process. But again, we don't need that committee to tell us that lying is bad. So the culture of the time defense isn't going to hold here either. You're talking about the fact that parents were requesting twins and being lied to, being told that they weren't available. So again, we're looking at something where a committee will formalise how this is done, but we already knew that this was perhaps legal, but certainly not ethical, as came up a few times. So the elegant design to disentangle genetics and environment really brings out something that we've all been working on in gene equality, which is looking at the burden on twins for things like medical and psychological research, and how we want to make sure we're not taking advantage of this unique sort of biological and environmental situation. So the justice concern about doing research on twins that's not always about twins, as you noted. So discussing about, consent for research, but also who's going to benefit from that research. And this ties into how you were talking about the data being locked down, but who's responsible for that data, that chest of knowledge, before it's unlocked? Are we, like, who is owning it? Are we able to use it? Is it ethical to benefit from unethical research? So there's a lot of arguments about that with the Nazi experimentation that you noted as well. But I think above all of that is the fact that ethical research is better science. You mentioned several times it was bad science, that it was methodologically not robust. And this is something, again, that an IRB or an HREC would help someone with, actually making it better science. It's often neglected that methodological strength is an ethical issue, and it's something really important to us. Bad science happens when it's not actually overseen by ethicists and other people involved in scientific development. So again, we didn't need the committee to tell us it was bad science necessarily, but they certainly would have highlighted that. We didn't need the committee to say it's wrong to lie and cheat people of their twinship and lie to adoptive parents. We already very much knew the child's well-being and human rights were a really important issue. So again, the culture of the time already knew that that was not the right thing to do. But again, the other thing you noted, that voice of authority that convinced people to do things that they did believe were wrong, to keep secrets from their own family and things like that. And again, you're wondering, how do these things happen? So the audience will be thinking, how did this go ahead? And that voice of authority is a huge factor there. And it's why when we teach our students about, pyramids of evidence and what's good evidence-based medicine, the voice of authority is really, really low. We do not consider that good evidence. If you're convincing, you're well-known, you're famous, that doesn't mean you're right. And again, this is something that it's really important for us to keep in mind when we're talking about what makes good science. Ethical science is good science. And I think your whole talk really did bring that to the foreground for us to think about, like, how did this happen and how do we stop it happening in future? So thank you so much for those insights.
Well, thank you. May I respond to just one or two points here that you brought up? And I really appreciate your discussion here. Eventually, the Child Development Center did form an IRB, a committee, when they were evaluating doing the book or not. But interestingly, Peter Neubauer, who was one of the authors on the book, was a member of that committee. So it was hardly an objective evaluation of that.
Yeah.
And a point I also wanted to bring up, this is going to sound so strange, but when they were talking about writing the book, they were actually thinking of publishing it in a different language, because they thought that way we'll get it out, but nobody will catch us. See,
Oh, no.
will raise issues against us. And it is preposterous. And they cited another researcher, Dr. Jule Nielsen, who did a reared-apart twin study in Denmark in 1980, 65, and then a follow-up in 1980. And he published in English. So they were saying, well, he published in English because he didn't want the Danish people to know about it. But he wanted his findings out in the world. If he published in Danish, nobody would have seen it. So there's another thing. Yeah. One other point I want to just raise, and this was nothing that you had talked about, but something I should have mentioned in the book, is I mentioned in the book, but not in the talk, is that which came first, Bernard's idea or the study itself, right? Or the idea for the study. And all along, when I was learning about this, I always thought it was Bernard's idea to separate, and then she contacted Peter Neubauer to do the study because he had the better methodologies in place. But then someone told me that Peter Neubauer always talked about doing a reared-apart twin study. And so it occurred to me that we don't really know. And one of the nieces of Viola Bernard that I interviewed said that Neubauer and Bernard were so close, you couldn't tell one from another. Ideas came out at the same time and all this. Now, I don't know this for sure, but it is possible that Neubauer had the idea and sought Bernard for the justification. It is possible that it went that way instead, because they had also separated twins prior to that. Bernard had separated twins at least in the 50s and I think in the early 60s before the study began. And there was never a thought about doing a twin study then. It was only later. So I think that's a possibility. And again, everybody thinks it was the justification and then the study. I'm not so sure.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. Over to you, Neera.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a very, very interesting presentation, Nancy. Thank you. My comments are quite similar to Evie's to some degree. I think as you were speaking and as I was preparing for this seminar, the one thing that came to my mind, and I'm sure it's come to others' minds, is that from a societal perspective, many people, not all, tend to have this fascination with twins and twin studies. And I asked myself why, and I'm like, why is there this fascination with twins? What is it that seems to drive us to this fascination with twins and twin studies? And I think it's either a fascination to my mind on one side, and this is quite extreme, but I thought it's either a fascination or it's a repulsion, and it's this idea that they're almost freakish. And that leads to people wanting to know more about twins or twin studies. And then I thought, well, where does that idea come from? And I think if you take it further back, we look at it in mythology, in religion, in fiction, in literature, in art. So there's lots of different things that are around us from an environmental perspective that seem to draw some sort of, as I keep using the word, fascination, or so there's something that lures us into knowing or wanting to know more about twins and twin studies.
I have a theory about that too, but I'm going to let you finish first.
So that was sort of my starting point in thinking about this wonderful seminar that you've just delivered, and making me think about what is it that's got me really sort of excited about wanting to hear this presentation today. And then on to the actual presentation that you gave, and I have a law background. So when you got to your slide about, well, they didn't do anything that was unlawful, I'm sitting here going, this seems crazy. Like, how is this lawful in any way? And the first thing that sort of came to my mind as you were speaking was, well, what about from a human rights perspective? We talk about human rights in law, and surely this separation from your kin and your blood and being completely stripped away from a sibling and family and the right to have family and all these things that we see in human rights. How could that be lawful? How could that be humane? How could this be, and to your point, clearly not ethical, and to Evie's points, not ethical. So we have these deep-rooted fundamental principles of what we think is good and right. And as I say, from a human rights perspective, surely this couldn't be lawful. But as you said, it was stated that it was lawful. And then I jumped forward as you were speaking, going, well, surely this wouldn't be allowed to happen today. But then how was it allowed to happen when it did? And not to say they got away with it, but it happened, and it happened for a long time during this study. So I thought about the ethical issues with that and the legal issues, which to my mind, well, there's a whole raft of human rights issues that have perhaps been, and human rights that have been stripped from these twins in the study. And while the number is small, the number is significant of the number of twins in that study. And the social implications of how that not only impacts the individuals in the study and their families, but broader society in, how societies function, where there's these sort of secret studies and you don't get access to the study, and how does that impact society? So my mind is further blown by your presentation, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of those issues around, the social implications and from a human rights perspective, and why is there this fascination with twins? So please.
Yeah, so great points that you raised, Neera. So let me start out with the fascination. I've thought about that a lot too, because there is this universal interest in twins. I think it's because we all are raised, and rightfully so, to believe in individual differences in appearance and behavior. So when we encounter two people who look and act so much alike, we find it very intriguing. Some people find it unsettling, but most people find it very intriguing, and they want to know more about it. And the idea that two people could do the same thing at the same time just seems so amazing and so beyond our experience that we are just drawn in by it. And there's something about seeing two matched forms that is just, it just creates a certain emotion, I think, in you. I don't know a lot about this, but all I know is that when you see two matched forms, it sort of warms people's hearts. But I think it's more the idea that it goes against the way we grow up to believe that the world works. So I think that's what it is. Now, you mentioned something freakish. I don't think that's what it is, because there have been books and plays written about conjoined twins, and those have not done so well. There was a big play on Broadway about a pair of conjoined sisters who were actually in the theater. And I thought it was a great play. I thought it was informative and entertaining, but people didn't want to see it. So I don't think it's the freakish aspect of twins that draw people. I think it's just simply the idea of two people being so much alike and accomplishing the same thing at the same time. Particularly think about twin athletes who are performing at the elite levels, who can do amazing things, and they're 1 second apart. I mean, it just boggles the mind. And I think we want to know more about that. So you raised a point about the law and human rights, and that's great. You know, I think we have to think about why these twins were separated. Remember that adoption agencies in those days had a lot of leeway. There were no real formal rules as to placement or anything like that. It was up to the discretion of the adoption workers, the social workers. So who came to Louise Wise Services? It was unmarried Jewish women who were pregnant with twins, and pregnant with babies, but pregnant with twins. And some of these mothers asked to have the twins placed in the same home. And they were told that it's impossible. Nobody wants twins together, which, as we know, was not the case. But if they have this justification that twins are better off apart, well, maybe that gets around the human rights. I'm not saying it does. I'm saying that that's the way they may have been thinking about it.
I see that.
Yeah. In fact, one mother was horrified to discover years later that when one of her twins in her 40s came to find her and asked about the sister, she said, well, weren't you raised with your sister? And she wasn't. So she was quite shocked. Yeah, and I think that, yeah, that was the human rights issue that you raised. Again, adoption agencies had a lot of freedom there. They could tell parents what they wanted. There were cases from Louise Wise on singleton children who developed schizophrenia, and parents were never told that the child was born to a schizophrenic mother or father, and the child was beautiful for a while and then developed schizophrenia in their late teens or 20s, and the parents had sued. But again, you know, it was a climate where adoption agencies could be secret about things, and also very much an area where environment was given the responsibility of causing psychopathology. So I think that's part of it.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Neera, and thanks, Evie, for raising some great points, and thanks, Nancy, for your clarification. At this stage, we're opening the floor to questions. Please send either in the YouTube chat if you're following live. Also, you can send them to at SSN Deakin as well through Twitter. We have 2 questions already on the board. Thanks to Lara Azevedo. First question for Nancy: do you believe this study will yield any insightful understandings about human development when the results are released in the future, or was it too methodologically fraught?
I think it was very highly methodologically flawed, and I think there's very little that we're going to gain from it. I've looked through some of the data, as I said, and a lot of it is very qualitative, very difficult to code. And there are some IQ scores that were obtained over time, but we have all that now. We don't need this. We have that from twins raised apart. So we don't need, and we had twins raised together. So we don't need this anymore. I think it sends a difficult message if we use that data. I guess my answer always is, if there's something in unethical data that could save a life, then I could justify using it. But I can't imagine anything in this study that would save a life. It's just impossible. And in fact, let me tell you a really horrendous, unethical thing that was done. So the researchers would go to the same twin pair. So you'd have the same researchers going to twin A's home and twin B's home, which was really not appropriate. You should have had independent people to avoid any kind of bias, right? In one case, the children had epilepsy. Both of them did. They were undergoing seizures. And so you would think at this point, they might have told the parents to find the best medical treatment, because the children were being treated very differently by their pediatricians. That stands out in my mind as being one of the most egregious events in that study, that these poor children with these horrendous medical symptoms were so neglected for the good of the study. So again, I don't think there's anything we can get out of this beyond human interest. And what's interesting too is that even though the data have been sequestered at Yale, there have been notices that researchers can write in and get permission to use it. I've written in twice, and I've been told I can't get it. Nobody has gotten in there. What I worry about is in 2065, the archive will be opened. Everybody will know everything about these people. Some of them may still be alive at the time. And I just don't see that as an appropriate step. You know, we also don't know who decided to put the data in the archives. It was done by the Jewish Board of Family and Child Services, which is the updated Jewish Board of Guardians. But I asked them, and I asked one of Neubauer's close colleagues, who made the decision? Nobody knows.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Nancy. I think also another point I'd like to add is that twins themselves say it's so important they know whether they know their identities, and even within twins, whether they're fraternal or identical, because for a reason that Nancy mentioned, is that if one of them is diagnosed with a condition, then the other one has usually, because of the genetic links, a high chance, a similar risk, if you like, at developing that condition. And therefore, the second twin can actually go and get tested if the first one presents. And so it is really important. It's one of the fundamental rights, human rights, that twins believe that they should be allowed information about their own genetic status.
Yes, and Jeff, just to follow up on that, I think that's especially true for identical twins, but also for fraternal twins. Yeah. And do you know, we don't know how many twins have been separated among the fraternals. We only know about the ones who have surfaced. There could be, oh, and here's another, so there may be others, and fraternal twins will not meet each other through mistaken identity. Most of the identical twins, if not all, met through mistaken identity. Now, Viola Bernard also said that if twins developed what she called the twinning reaction, which meant that if in the first 6 months they developed a kind of interactional pattern or relationship with one another, she did not separate them. And that is also not the case, because Howard and Doug, a pair of males, were so closely entwined by 6 months, and they were placed in separate homes. So my point is that if she did place twins together, where are they? Why have we never heard about them? I think the answer is she didn't do
it. Thanks, Nancy. There's I should also add now, talking of twins, there are any twins in the audience or parents of twins, please feel free to ask questions. We'll fast track you up to make sure that you get airtime. So we're with you, twins and parents of twins. So Lara asked a second question. In terms of legality, this is an interesting one. She wonders if adoption centers today are allowed to separate twins if they cannot or if they're unable to find families that are willing to raise both.
Well, it's a great question. And again, there are no rules. There are no legalities surrounding the placement of twins. The guidelines, the conventional wisdom is that you try to place them together. And I will say that I think it should not be difficult because there are so many families out there who are desperate for children. And to have a pair of twins is such a bonus. But twins are still being separated. I know that. Sometimes they can't find a family, so they'll do it. Sometimes the biological family wants to keep one. Do you know that the very first pair of IVF conceived twins were separated?
Oh,
The mother who conceived them wanted only a girl and gave the boy away,
wow, didn't know that.
which is quite amazing, quite amazing. But twins are still being separated for odd reasons, but certainly they've never been separated because of a study. That's clear. And in fact, at Louise Wise Services, they try to get the cooperation of other agencies in the New York area, and everyone refused. And Bernard said, well, they explain it by the mystique of twins. I mean, she used that word so lightly that it was really quite irritating. And Peter Neubauer, he approached Catholic Charities, interestingly, Sister Bernard, and initially she was going to go along with it, and she changed her mind. And he said, well, you separate parents and children all the time, but that's a different issue. That's parents willingly giving up children for adoption in the hopes of a better life for those kids.
Thanks, Nancy. Evie, you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify a point that you brought up before. It sounds like you're essentially saying that there was no real ethical or scientific review of the study initially. There seemed to be some sort of post hoc justification, perhaps, to do the study, and that there was more of an ethical debate regarding publishing the findings. And it sounds like there was a lot more concern about the archive and locking that down. So do you think that was genuinely sort of ethical concern, or was it just the researchers trying to protect themselves from the controversy?
Clearly the second. I
Yeah.
think it was they were trying to protect themselves. I don't think they had any concern for ethics, because if they did, I think they would have thought very carefully about this study, and they just didn't. And again, I have so much trouble understanding Peter Neubauer, who himself had to be separated from his family to study medicine in another country, and yet seemed to have no trouble separating these twins. And a pair of twins who were separated actually went to his home. They've written about it in a book called Identical Strangers, shorter version of the movie. And they asked him, and they pushed him, and he wouldn't say yes. And all he says is, well, if I didn't endorse it, I wouldn't have gone along with it. But that's a very indirect kind of answer. It gets around it without really coming across. Now, I'll tell you about Peter Neubauer and that visit I had with him. It was the perfect 50-minute hour, the psychoanalytic hour on the bench. And he showed no remorse, absolutely no remorse for what he did. He feels like what he did was justified. The other thing is that he said to me, you know, I think those triplets were not identical because they were separate placenta. So I said to him, we diagnosed them. We did extensive testing in Minnesota. They are identical. And as you know, early splitting, or they assume that early splitting identicals can have separate placenta. We don't know if that's actually the timing, but about 1/3 of identical twins do have separate placenta. But he refused to believe it. He was that type of person who made reality conform to his beliefs, to his wants, his desires.
Thanks, Nancy. I have a one point, if I may. We're waiting for more questions, and a question. The point is that when I was listening to the book early on, I thought, well, Nancy's a twin researcher. You know, she's talking about other twin researchers, but she's also talking about the, you know, twins as well. Who will she side with in the end? And so it really, you steered a very clear line with an open mind right down the middle. And just because you didn't treat the researchers any specially because they were twin researchers, you weighed up all those factors that you've gone through today, and you listened to the human factor, I think, of the twins. And it was that really came across strong, that they felt betrayed, they felt angry. And so in this kind of situation, when it's one side or the other, it was overwhelmingly came down, it was a negative experience for the twins. And this is what you listen to, and this is kind of a theme that is slowly emerging, that researchers need to listen to their populations.
That's
I was talking with some students yesterday, and we were talking about not assuming that the public is not very knowledgeable, and that really that needs educating. In the end, it's us as researchers that need educating from the public about their opinions on research. And I think that's something that was actually missing. They didn't canvass twins or their parents at the beginning of the study.
Well, you know, what's interesting is Viola Bernard had a niece that I mentioned, and she had identical twin daughters. And I thought to myself, did she ever try to separate them? And she never did. Now, here's an interesting point. If separating twins was such an important feature of their positive rearing, why didn't she take this justification to child development institutes, to the American Psychological Association, to the American Psychiatric Association, to parenting groups? You know, it would be difficult, and I'm playing devil's advocate in a way, but it's difficult for parents. You know, they love their children to give one away, but parents make sacrifices for their kids all the time. Why was it only justified for twins being given up for adoption? That's what I don't understand. If it was such a wonderful plan, then why not implement it on a large scale? And that never happened. And to your point, Jeff, about, you know, even though I'm a twin researcher and I take a dim view of these twin researchers, what I tried to do in the book was to keep myself and my opinions out of it until the very end, because I wanted people to draw their own conclusions. And at the very end, of course, I let loose. And I guess you have to decide what you're willing to accept in a person. Both Viola Bernard and Peter Neubauer did some wonderful work with families. Peter Neubauer did some wonderful work with language and single parent families. And Viola Bernard did some things with patients. But I could not tolerate this one thing that they did. Maybe some people could. I could not. This, to me, goes against everything I believe that twinship symbolizes, both for humanity and for science. And it was such a blemish on their careers that no matter what else they did, would not make up for it.
The question I want to ask is that you mentioned in the book that twins have got the closest relationships of all human relationships. And can you, and those of us that are not twins, don't really understand that. Can you say something a little bit more about the close bond within pairs of twins right from the start, and how this, made things, made things even worse when they found out they were separated?
Well, the twin relationship is unique, the identical twin relationship, in that it brings up complete trust and acceptance, and it's non-judgmental. And I'm not saying that identical twins don't fight with each other. Of course they do. All siblings do. But there is an unbreakable bond between the vast majority of them, an understanding that I think goes beyond what people typically have with siblings or parents. Certainly there is some overlap, but we have to think about what is the general trend. And it's this acceptance and non-judgmental aspect. And I think we don't really watch the evolution of the twin bond. You really can't watch it, but you can see when identical twins are young and they're playing together, and they form little patterns in their interactions, and they respond to things in the same way. I think that's what it is. When they respond to things in the same way, that sort of creates an affirmation that, yes, you're one of me, whereas fraternal twins regard things in very different ways. So I think that's a lot of it. And it's a celebrated relationship. And so, as Jeff said, when these identical twins learned what they could have had and what they were deprived of for that ridiculous reason, that they were guinea pigs at the hands of these scientists who were just blindly pursuing an ambition that they never really succeeded in. I mean, just put yourself in those shoes. just the anger, the sadness, the hurt that they and their families feel. The families suffered too. And, it goes beyond just the twins. It goes to the parents. It goes to the non-twin siblings. When the researchers would come to the homes, the non-twin siblings, who are often also adopted from Louise Wise, would say, well, where's my testing? And they'd have to give them little tasks to do. These kids felt very left out, something that Louise Wise never considered. And another thing I want to say is that some of the researchers, I said would not talk on the record. Well, there's a woman I spoke to who did she did at least 2 twin pairs, and she did both members of each pair. And she told me that while she was doing it, she didn't feel right about it because she knew something of vital importance about those kids that the parents did not know. And she said she never spoke about it with anyone except her husband. No one knows she was part of this. I do. I know her name, but I would never mention it to anybody. And she's referred to anonymously in there. So the fact that there was this sense of something not quite right, but graduate students are vulnerable and you want to please your mentor. And so one way to justify it would be, well, if my mentor says it's okay, it must be okay, even if I'm uncomfortable with it. I'll learn to live with it. So I think that we have to be very careful and maybe instruct our students that if they see something or they're asked to do something they're not careful with, they have to speak up. It's important. They run the risk of maybe losing the mentorship or whatever, but it puts them in a very difficult position.
Karina, you had a question. Do you want to ask it in person, or would you like me to read it out?
Oh, I'm happy to ask in person.
Great.
I can put my camera on too. My question, I guess, is for Nancy, Evie, and/or Neera, and I'm trying to think about the sort of the ethical assessment process. If you think about the idea that maybe we can use unethical data to save a life, right? So, I mean, this kind of quandary comes up in sort of novels all the time, and it's in Ian McEwan's Children Act, it's in a Jodi Picoult, my sister, but those don't have to do with twins. And I guess I'm curious as to how, and maybe you've answered this in some way, Nancy, like how the twin relationship sort of intensifies or makes the proximity to the life being saved more or less important. But from an ethical perspective, can we justify using unethical data gained in unethical ways or unethical means to save a life? And is that decision influenced by the degree of relationship? And I'm just curious as to how that's approached from all these perspectives.
Yeah, I guess from the twin study data that we've talked about today, I don't think there's anything we can retrieve that would save a life. I think I was thinking more closely about the Nazi data that was collected on the twins in Auschwitz. And I was at a big conference once where that was all being debated because somebody wanted to use the non-twin data on hypothermia collected at Majdanek to understand more about reviving people from near drowning accidents. Is that ethical? Again, I think the only way you could justify it would be if you could save a life, if there was absolutely no other methodology we had available to us, but you'd have to be extremely careful in any kind of a report or anything like that, because I worry that if a researcher does something unethical, say 30 years earlier, and then somebody uses it, does that then justify what he did? So I worry about that, but it would have to be done extremely carefully. And I really don't know of any example of that. When I was doing my research on the twin Holocaust survivors, I asked them how they feel about using any of their data, and they were very divided. Some of them said we should use the data because it would justify our horrific experiences, and others said absolutely not because it sends a bad message. Now, the twins and their families from the Neubauer and Bernard study, they kind of wanted the data to be used. Some of the fathers and mothers complained that they went through this whole process and nothing ever came of it. So that's one problem. The researchers were a little bit reluctant because they felt that if the twins and the families recognized each other, in the text, then they could be sued. I mean, they were so worried about that. I know somebody asked a question before, Evie, I think, about were they protecting themselves or who they were protecting, but it was definitely themselves that they were worried about. It was not the twins. I mean, I would like to know if anyone knows an example of unethical data that actually saved a life. I'd like to know how that was determined and what the ramifications were of using data in that way. Because I can't think of an example offhand.
Fascinating question.
Yeah.
I have a question. It's to what extent, when the twins you spoke of, like, grew up in ignorance, they had a twin, but did they actually feel something important was missing in their lives at all? Did they have a general feeling that something was missing or something was wrong?
Yeah. So that's a very frequent question that comes up. And some of them did and some of them didn't. But I am very reluctant to link that to a missing twinship, although the twins are ready to do that. But I think it comes more from the idea of being adopted and knowing that you were given up and maybe you don't match with your family. Even though these twins were showered with love for the most part, I think that's really what it was. There's no such thing, to my mind, of intrauterine knowledge of twinship. You have to be told that you're a twin. And in the Minnesota study, the twins were shocked to discover they were twins sometimes, that they didn't know about it till adulthood. So unless you're really told, I don't think that there's something, if it's missing, Jeff, I think it has to do with family as opposed to a twin.
Yeah. And you do mention about how far memory goes back in your book. And I think with regards to that, as a psychologist, are there different kinds of memory? So you have a visual memory, and so you would also have an emotional memory. Now, are they separate things, or are they tightly linked? And would you remember further back if it's subconscious, if it's an emotional memory rather than a visual memory?
Well, I think that those possibilities are there. We don't really know for sure, but I'm sensing that in that pair, Howard and Doug, were very closely intertwined at 6 months. I don't mean they were discussing things with each other, but they were, touching and this and that. And they were referred to in the archives as the most stable object in each other's family. So when that is suddenly missing, there may be something missing there, but we don't really know what it is. It's sort of like in the work that I do on the loss of a twin. Sometimes these mothers tell me that they lost a twin, say at age 6 months, there was an accident or something happened. And the other twin reacts in horrendous ways, but doesn't really understand, just knows that something is missing. So I think that's what it is, right? They don't know that it's a twin that they're losing. They don't know what a twin even is. But I think it's just the idea of the physical comfort. I think that's what happened with Howard and Doug's case. And they did both talk about something always being missing, but they never could define it. They never could define it.
I've got a couple more questions, but does anyone else have any questions at this point?
There's 12 in the chat room. I don't know if anybody put in the chat.
Can't see any more up there. While we okay, so nothing from live, Karina said. So another question I had is, how long did it take you to track down everyone from the book, over time? And, that's a great, how long did it actually take you to actually do the research and actually find people?
Well, when I got the book contract, it took about 3 years to find everybody. And that was during COVID. So I had to do a lot of work online. I would always ask people, do you know somebody else? These networks are great. You can ask somebody, do you know this one? Yeah. But I had done some interviews prior to the book contract, such as when I interviewed Peter Neubauer when I went to his home. And I also interviewed another woman who was closely attached to the study. She passed away, so I couldn't go back. And I was told that her daughter has a lot of access to documents. I tried so hard to write letters to the daughter. I mean, I tried 1,000 times. I couldn't get anything. Sometimes you have dead ends, but it took me all of about 3 years to track everybody down. You know, I could have gone further. I mean, there are always more people you can find, but at a certain point, a book has to be written and you have to stop. That's one thing I've learned.
Yeah, well, I guess that leads on to my next question, which was, who would you really like to have interviewed but didn't get the chance to?
Peter Neubauer's son, both of his sons. And they were not going to interview with me. They just weren't. Though, oh, and here's, it's interesting too. One of Peter Neubauer's colleagues, Dr. Lois Oppenheim, who's a professor at Montclair State in New Jersey, she is a big fan of his and protected him and wrote all kinds of, what's the word, complimentary articles about him. She said to me, you'll never find the son, never get his email. She said she would contact him for me and the answer will be no. That's what she told me. She did that. Well, I found him on my own and it was a very nice exchange. He did not want to be part of this. But at one point I went back to him and I said, the picture I have of your dad is really terrible. And I know there's one online that your wife took. Could I use that? And he willingly let me use that. Then there was a younger son and he wanted no part of it either. I think that was a mistake on their part because they ran the risk that I'm going to write everything without them, without their feedback. So I think that was a mistake on their part. But they just weren't comfortable anymore. They wanted things, they wanted things to go away. They just wanted this to go to rest. And my book brought out a lot more of this than I think they wanted. So what can I say?
Yeah, it's a good point about, I guess it goes runs to news journalism as well. If someone doesn't comment about something, I mean, we've got first of all the right to privacy that's paramount. But then if someone, if someone that's conducted a study or led a company and they're in the news, then you might assume if they didn't want to talk about it, that they're trying to hide something. But as you said, there are other issues there. They might not want to dredge memories up, etc. And basically, they do have a right to remain silent, I guess, if they want to.
See, this is what I also object to about this study. It was so shrouded in secrecy. I mean, I looked at a lot of the correspondence, and the minute somebody outside their close social circle got wind of it, they got very upset. Everything was shrouded in secrecy. So Yale archive has been locked up, and the Columbia one was too for a while. What is so hidden that we can't know about? And why do the twins have to go through this rigorous process where they're interviewed by a psychologist? In the book chapter that I found from Viola Bernard, there were these little snippets about each pair of twins, and they're labeled C1 through C11, so you know who's who. And I figured out who everybody was. And you know what I did? I copied them and sent them to the twins. And you know what? It was fine. The twins didn't have nervous breakdowns. They're adults. I asked them if they wanted it. I showed it to nobody else. I said, if you want to show it to your twin, you can, but I'm not going to do it for you. So the fact that everything was so shrouded in secrecy, I think, gives us ideas that there's a lot of bad stuff in there that we don't know about. And that may not be the case. It may not be the case, but because they shrouded in secrecy, I think we think that way.
Yeah, I think it does happen a lot. I'm reading a book about Theranos, the company that Elizabeth Holmes set up, and throughout the whole process, there was a whole lot of secrecy, a need to know basis, it very slowly emerged that it's people started having these doubts about about the integrity of the research and the validity of the research. But it got so far, all that secrecy, that individuals had these doubts, but it really is something that was just based on a total lack of knowledge, and was it did get so far. But so I think it's maybe a lesson in that when we feel that something's wrong with a person or with a study, we should speak up,
Yes.
or go to them first. But it's one of those things that I thought, God, it's so easy for this for bad research to get out there or to be developed, especially if no one says anything, and especially if there's a very charismatic person leading the research.
Of course, and the way findings get out to the public is through journals that don't provide you with details, so people have a chance or don't have the background to really evaluate it the way that they should. So I think there's a lot of bad science out there, and that's why I think we get inconsistent findings from studies, because methodology differs and maybe is not done properly. So we get inconsistent findings that we don't really know how to apply or to accept. Your point about speaking off the record or people who don't want to speak, there were three categories of people I had: people who were willing to speak with their name, people willing to speak without their name, and people not willing to speak at all. And so, of course, I prefer the name, but I will take people who will speak without their name because that's information I would lose otherwise. And I know that the New York Times does that a lot. Somebody who's not allowed to speak, somebody close to a candidate, something like that.
Off the record.
And they do it a lot, and sometimes they've been criticized for it. But having done this book, I can really understand that. I really can, because the person is trusting you. And so, they're trusting you not to use their name, and you just got to abide by that. And I did in every single case. And something else I do when I write, if I do quotes or I get information from people, I send it back to them because I want things to be completely accurate.
Yeah, fact checking.
You would be amazed at how many people say, I never said that. And meanwhile, I haven't. That's just something that happens. I always feel like the truth is somewhere in the middle of all of this.
Yeah, and Evie adds, sounds like the vulnerable don't get privacy, but the powerful do. That's a message. That's a phenomenon that keeps going. The powerful have the ways and means to to dodge the truth sometimes and to dodge the questions until they're subpoenaed, presumably. Oh, we have one. What's likely to be a last question from Lara V, who asks, what was the most rewarding part of writing your book?
Oh, I think the most rewarding part was getting the twins' stories out there, because these twins want their stories to be told, and they want the researchers, they're not alive anymore, but they want the people who were associated with the study to suffer. They want people to know what they went through, and they want people to know the importance of twinship and what it meant for them to have that relationship denied. So that to me was very, very satisfying. And the fact that I had that book party in June, the book came out in November of 2021. We had the party in New York City in June of 2022. And it was so wonderful about that was that so many people who I wrote about, twins and family members and ethicists and lawyers, were there. And just having everybody there and just telling me that it was great to have that book finally done, that was absolutely great. It was absolutely great. And the other great thing was having Jeff invite me to the seminar. That was very rewarding.
Thanks, Nancy. And I hope I'm sure you've been asked to talk about it other places as well, and you will continue to be. So really, thanks for giving us a taste and overview of the book today. It's an absolutely fascinating book from so many different perspectives: the ethical, legal, moral, just the human. As you said, in the end, it's the human perspective that's paramount and that needs to be listened to. So thanks very much, and we will meet each other at the International Twins Congress in Budapest and have more chats about your different books.
Absolutely.
And also thanks for Evie, Kendal, and Neera, Bhatia for your thoughtful comments about Nancy's book, and also thanks to Katrina and for Emma for monitoring questions and for going on social media. So, and thanks for the audience that is listening to us live, and the audience which is always bigger than the live audience, especially in different time zones. The audience that will listen to this in the days, weeks, and months to come. So there is a link there that you can listen to this. So thanks everybody for listening.